Hello and welcome to the Practice as Research Network seminar series. It's really exciting to have everybody here. It's been quite a few months since we've had the last of this installment over the summer break, and then obviously COVID-related illness. We had to postpone one of our talks as well, but hopefully we're back into the swing of things now and we can do them regularly again. I must say that I have quite missed them, so I'm really, really excited to have them back. And it's really even more exciting for me. Today we have somebody here who is our guest presenter and who's actually from my own department at work. So this is, doubly exciting because it's always nice to hear other people talk from different disciplines. But, when you actually realize that actually you've got some really interesting stuff going on in the very place where you work, and you don't usually get time to talk to people's research, this is a nice way of actually catching up with people and friends. So I do enjoy that as well. So today we have got with us Dr. Ana Pellicer-Sánchez, who's going to be talking about what it means to be ethical when you're researching cognitive processes in language learning. And specifically, she's going to be talking about eye tracking. And I'm quite excited about that because I'm very conscious when I'm sitting in front of the camera like this, that I'm looking into the camera and not my screen. So, the eye tracking thing is kind of at the back of my mind as well. So that's something that's really exciting. To kind of introduce Ana very briefly, Dr. Ana Pellicer-Sánchez is Associate Professor of Applied Linguistics and TESOL at the Institute of Education, UCL's Faculty of Education and Society in the UK. Her research focuses on the teaching and learning of vocabulary in a second or foreign language. And her recent research has used eye tracking to examine the cognitive processes involved in vocabulary learning, with a particular focus on learning from reading. Ana is a co-author of An Introduction to Eye Tracking, a guide for applied linguistics research, and co-editor of Understanding Formulaic Language, published in Routledge. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Ana. What I'm going to do is I'm going to stop sharing my screen first of all, and then Ana, if you could just do your presentation first. I will keep my video on so that you can see me, so you're not talking to an
Yeah, no worries.
But I will mute myself so there is no it's not no echoing or anything. So when you're talking, I'm going to mute myself. And then after that, we're going to sort of have a little bit of a discussion. And I always take this opportunity to kind of ask questions first. This is my prerogative as the person hosting it. So I'm always getting the first question, which is really nice. But everybody else in the room, please do feel free to raise your hand, virtual or real, to unmute yourself later, but also to raise any questions that you may have in the chat box, which I will keep an eye on as well. So please, Ana, if you would like to share your screen.
Yes. Let me see if it worked before, so let's hope it does work here. Can you see the slides? Just the slide.
Yes.
Perfect. Excellent. Okay, so I'll get started. Well, thank you. First of all, thank you very much, Nicole, for the invitation. It really is a pleasure for me. Also, it's always a good opportunity to talk about our research and what we do, but this has a slightly different focus and is a slightly different audience. So it's always good because I'm sure will be an interesting discussion, and I will learn from these as well. So it's quite it's quite exciting for me to be here today. As Nicole was saying, what I will do is I'm going to be talking about how we use eye tracking to explore cognitive processes in language learning and related ethical considerations. So what I thought I would do, I'm not sure how familiar everybody is with eye tracking, so I would provide a very brief overview of what it is, what the technique involves, and also provide a brief overview of some of the key applications in language learning, those things that I've been working on for the last few years, focusing on vocabulary learning, one of the topics that I've explored using eye tracking. And then at the end, I've listed a few of the main ethical considerations that arise from this research. I'm sure that you can think of more. So, so we'll leave that for the discussion. But I've included some of those main ethical considerations that arise from this type of research. So eye tracking is basically, for those of you who are not familiar with these, is basically a device that we use to measure learners or participants' eye movements while they're processing any sort of a stimuli on a computer screen. So it could be a text, it could be an image, it could be a movie. So anything that we display on a computer screen, then with the eye tracker device, we measure participants' eye movements while they're processing these different types of stimuli. There are many different types of equipments and different types of systems that we could use, and I'll talk about that at the end, because of course considerations are different depending on the one that you are using. So it provides a very rich record of processing behavior. So where participants and learners, in my case, are actually looking at and for how long. So from the very early days, it was considered as an opportunity to look into the mind of the subject. And this is key why we've started to use it in language learning research as well. So as I was saying, it measures eye movements, and in particular, it measures 3 different types of eye movements. Saccades, which are the very fast movements of the eye. So when we move from one point to another, when we're reading a text, or when we're looking at a picture or watching a movie. So the movements, the rapid movements of the eye would be called saccades. Fixations are basically the stops, the times where we stop and fixate on a particular part of the text or image or whatever the stimulus is. And regressions, this is particularly for reading. These are movements back in a text. So we are reading and then we move back to reread other parts of the text. And I'll show an example so that it's clear. So imagine that this is a sentence that we are presenting people with, and we want to know how they are processing these types of this particular sentence. So the gray circles here on the screen are basically fixations. So number 1 to 6 are the stops, the points where our eyes stop to process information. And these are the points where information is actually processed. There is not that much information processed during saccades, so it's mainly those fixations, those stops of our eyes where we process information. So the arrows A to E would be the saccades, and then at the end we have an example of a regression. So we would start reading this sentence: the woman saw the man with binoculars, and then we go back again and we read man and the end of binoculars again. So these movements back would be regressions. But I won't go too much into the the details of the measures and all that, just for us to have an idea of what types of eye movements we measure with these equipment. So the important thing is the assumptions behind these. So one of the main assumptions behind the study of eye movements is that the amount of time that we spend fixating an item, stopping to process a particular item. When I say item, it could be, a word or a part of an image or dynamic image. It reflects the cognitive effort required to process it. And that what we are fixating is what is being considered. So when we fixate on a particular word or part of a visual display, that reflects the cognitive effort that is involved in processing, and that this is actually what we are considering, right? So it has many advantages. It can be done without a secondary task, and this is important for experiments that actually explore things like processing time and reading, because you don't need to ask participants to do anything other than just sit back and read whatever we present on the screen or watch this movie. They don't necessarily need to press a button or do really record any sort of measure, any sort of response as other techniques would require. As I was saying earlier, it provides a very rich record of processing behavior, so we can know exactly where participants are looking at and for how long. So eye tracking data is normally reported in terms of number of fixations, the number of how many times people stopped in that particular area that you're interested in, and the duration of those fixations, so for how long. And whether that particular area was fixated or was skipped. And data is often also reported in terms of early and late measures. There are loads of different eye tracking measures that I'm not going to get into, but just some of those reflect more automatic processing and others more controlled strategic processing. So that just for us to know. So there are challenges when so eye tracking was obviously very much used. It was a common technique in cognitive psychology and psycholinguistics for decades. It's been really in the last 10 years or so that it's really been started to be used in language learning and second language acquisition research. And there has been a huge increase in the number of studies using it because obviously of the benefits and how useful it is to explore underlying cognitive processes. There are important challenges as well that we need to consider. So especially when we use this technique, as I've done, as we are doing in the field to explore language learning processes, we have to be careful about how representative it is of real learning situations. I mean, remember that in the majority of cases, we are, data is collected in a lab, in an eye tracking lab with the students one by one. It's very difficult to mimic real classroom and real language learning situations. There are very few exceptions around the world of, labs where they have, 10 or 15 different equipments, but they're very expensive. So that's very rare. So in the majority of cases, we have one or two eye trackers in a lab. So that's something to consider. It's important to consider as well that in this kind of more applied language learning contexts, eye tracking and the examination of eye movements cannot really tell us everything about cognitive processing. So we'll be able to say, okay, learners spent this amount of time on this item in comparison to this other. They seem to pay more attention to this part or the other, but very often it's not possible to know why exactly they were spending, more attention on a particular part of the stimulus. So that's something to consider. And very importantly, eye movements are very precise measurements, and they're affected by many, many different factors. So the actual appropriate design of eye tracking studies is key. And the design is related to how, the claims that we can actually make based on the data. So I'll show an example so that you see what I mean. So this is an image from an ad. This is a heat map. So it's just a visual representation of eye movements. The red areas are basically the areas that received most attention. So if we look at these, what can we say about the processing of this advertisement? Well, we can say that these participants seem to spend more time reading the title, the first part of the text, and definitely the face of the baby. If we look at another representation where we see the order of the stops, of the fixations, we could say that they first look at the text. Well, that's probably a landing fixation, but anyway, and then the baby, and then finally the title. But we can't really say much about the processing of specific words in the text, mainly because the text is too small for us to be able to make claims about that. So this is just to show how important the design of the materials and the stimuli is in this type of eye tracking experiment. So when possible, it's good to modify materials and create them ourselves to make sure that the data can answer our research questions. And if we use authentic materials, there will be a range of variables that we'll have to control for in the analysis, or that might just limit the claims that can be made. So I think this is really important when we're thinking about applications of eye tracking to different areas. So as I was saying, it has received recently a huge amount of attention from language learning and second language acquisition researchers. It has been applied and used in many different topics. I've particularly used it to explore the process of learning from written input, so learning from reading, particularly focusing on vocabulary learning in the majority of studies. And also I've looked at learning from multimodal exposure. So when people have access to, text, but also images audio input, dynamic images, so how attention is actually split in those cases. But I'm just going to focus on learning from reading today and show you a couple of examples of basically what we found from these research. So focusing on vocabulary learning from reading. When we talk about the different learning approaches, vocabulary learning approaches, we usually make this distinction between a more intentional learning and incidental learning approaches. So intentional learning, when there is a clear intention to learn vocabulary and a clear a focus on learning a set of words, like when learners complete vocabulary activities, there is a clear goal to learn vocabulary. And more incidental approaches are those where the learning happens as a sort of consequence of the reading activity, of the communicative activity. So the focus is on meaning, not necessarily on form. So when we talk about incidental learning, we're basically referring to learning from reading while listening or viewing. So there are lots of research showing that just when learners read for pleasure or watch a movie or listen to a podcast, they also improve their vocabulary knowledge and they can learn new words from that, even if their focus is really just on the meaning and the content of whatever is it that they're exposed to. So loads of research has provided evidence for these. I'm really focusing today on learning from reading. So the main kind of design of these studies, the traditional design of studies looking at vocabulary learning from reading, is that where we have a pre-test, a reading activity, and then a post-test. So in the pre-test, we measure knowledge of a set of words that are going to appear later in a reading text. And then after the reading, we measure knowledge again to see how much they've learned. And this design has been great. And this kind of research design has allowed us to really find out more about what learners get from reading, what they remember after the reading activity, what they can remember about those new words that they were exposed to. But it doesn't really tell us much about what happens when learners are actually reading the text and they find words they don't know. I mean, we of course hypothesize that, in the majority of cases, learners could skip the words or they could try to guess from context, but we really don't know. And eye tracking really provides a great means to actually find out what happens as they are reading the text. So this is certainly something that has been explored in vocabulary learning research. In the first language context, so looking at first language reading, studies have found in general, as we would expect, that when first language readers are reading a text and they find words they don't know, they would spend more time reading those new words when compared to words that they know very well. And that reading times decrease with exposure. So that means the more times you see another word, the faster your reading becomes. And that makes sense. That means you are, building your familiarity with that word and learning that new word. In the second language context, as I was saying, the last 8 years or so, there have been loads of studies that have tried to use eye tracking to explore vocabulary learning from reading. We found a similar pattern. So studies tend to show longer reading times for unknown vocabulary. So when L2 learners, second language learners, are reading a text and they find words they don't know, they tend to spend more time processing. They spend more attention. They pay more attention, on those words that they don't know. Reading times decrease with more exposure. So the more time they read it, the faster the reading and more fluent the reading becomes. We found similar patterns for single words and also formulaic sequences like collocations, so items beyond the single word. And also, importantly, for language learning researchers, some studies, not all, some studies have found a connection between the amount of attention that we pay, that learners pay to words in reading, and how well those words are learned. And that's key because that's one of the main theories of language learning, this idea of noticing, and I'll get to that in a minute. So so far so good, and eye tracking has really allowed us to learn a lot about vocabulary learning, but we also know that incidental vocabulary learning from reading and any other source really depends, as I was saying, on the involvement, on the degree of involvement in processing. So the degree of attention. Learners need to pay attention to those words. Otherwise, they need to notice those novel words in the input. Otherwise, chances are that they will not learn those words. And this is really related, as I was saying, to important theories in second language acquisition, like noticing hypothesis or depth of processing hypothesis. So an important question for vocabulary researchers and SLA researchers has been to find ways to promote that and make sure that learners actually see and pay attention and notice those words that they don't know. So many different methods have been explored in the literature. One of them, or one of those that has received the most attention, I think, is this idea of pre-modification of input. So things like bolding, underlining, as you have here, the example here with highlighting. So all these techniques seem to support the noticing of those items, and then leads to higher gains. And we have studies both in vocabulary and grammar learning as well. And the couple of studies that have done this with eye tracking has also shown that all these techniques of bolding, underlining actually lead to more attention. So they're good attention drawing devices. But one of these methods that I was really interested in, and I've done a few studies on this area, this is what I wanted to show to you in a very brief format, is instructional intervention before reading. Those of you, I'm not sure whether some of you are involved in language teaching, or, well, you might have experience as language learners. This is a very, very common activity in the language classroom, where we teach a set of words before we actually find them in a text. So if there is a set of words that we find are going to be very difficult for learners, we teach them first that relevant vocabulary, and then we ask them to read a text containing those words. So the vocabulary is initially learned through that explicit intentional learning, and then it is consolidated in reading. So it supports lexical inferencing from reading as well. That's what researchers have said. And there is some empirical evidence showing that it actually works for vocabulary learning, and it makes sense. That's what we would expect. But now there have been, researchers have said different things about the effect of this instructional intervention before reading on the actual processing. So some researchers have said that it might increase the salience of the words and make learners pay more attention. But also the researchers have said that it might discourage guessing strategies. So since they already know what they mean, they might not pay that much attention to the words, and that might affect the learning process. And this was something that I was really interested in and thought, well, eye tracking can help here. And we can really see whether teaching words before reading actually impacts how learners deal with those words while they're reading the text. And that's precisely what I did together with colleagues, Kathy Conkling and Laura Wilkaite, in a couple of studies that we recently conducted. Basically, we compared, I'm not going to go into the details of the study, and you can ask later if you have questions. But basically, we compared pre-reading instruction, so participants who actually receive teaching of a set of vocabulary items, so a set of words, before reading them in a text, with participants who were only exposed to those words in a text. So they received no instruction whatsoever. And we had a control condition where they read a text with real words and familiar words that they knew very well. So this is, for example, one page of the text that they read. It contained some pseudo words, and we'll talk about that at the end. So they had to read a short story with these unfamiliar items repeated 8 times throughout the story. And we recorded the eye movements in the different conditions that I mentioned. So after the reading, we measure how much they had learned about the words. And then we also looked at the eye movement data. And basically what we found was that in terms of vocabulary tests, pre-reading instruction led to the highest scores, and that's expected, right? They receive instruction and then they read the text. So in terms of the actual vocabulary knowledge, it was the best group compared to reading only. Now, in terms of eye movements, we have here a summary. Basically, what we find was that the very first time that learners saw those words, there was no difference whatsoever between the pre-reading instruction and the reading-only condition. So that means it didn't matter if they had been taught the items or not. They actually spent a very similar amount of attention, which was against what we expected. And of course, way longer than the control items, so the words that they knew very well. And towards the end, what we find is an advantage of the pre-reading instruction. So there were no differences at the beginning, but once they had seen those words 8 times, the participants in the pre-reading instruction condition were actually able to read those new words in a very similar way to control items, so to words that they knew very well. So that means that the reading was much more kind of fluent when compared to reading only. So that points to an advantage of pre-reading instruction for the processing of this new vocabulary. So it is really with these, I just wanted to show the kind of things that eye tracking can allow researchers to actually know about the process, in this particular case, the process of vocabulary learning from reading. So it's been great so far in really allowing us to see not only what happens after and, you know, what kind of knowledge they remember from the words, but actually how that learning happens and the amount of effort, the amount of attention that is put into dealing with these unknown vocabulary, which we know is something that learners actually deal with a lot. So still a lot to do, but I think we've accumulated quite interesting evidence for the last few years. Now, ethical considerations. The first one has to do with the equipment. So the first thing that we consider with this type of experiment is any potential, you know, equipment-related risks. I've put different pictures here. The first two, where you actually had to wear something as a sort of weird helmet. This is the eye tracker that I used when I started learning and using eye tracking. And that was no good at all, in the sense that it was heavy and it got warm with time. So we had to be very careful about that. We had to be very clear about that in information sheets for participants. We had to be very careful with the duration of the experiment, because of course people couldn't be wearing that for 4 hours. I mean, it would have been ethical to ask them to do that. So we had to be very careful about the duration of the experiment and be clear about that, you know, in the information sheet. Another important thing is that usually, I mean, with eye tracking, what happens is that we have a camera, an infrared light that captures your pupil, and we have to be clear that there are no known risks for vision. But usually participants need to know these. Now we are lucky in that the systems that we use are much less intrusive. So it depends on which system you use, but at least the one that I use is head-free. So you don't have to put anything in your head. Sometimes we ask people to put their chin in a chin rest or forehead rest, so to control for movement. And again, this is something important, because if we do that, we have to consider how long the experiment is, for how long can people actually sit still without moving. So it tends to be relatively shorter experiments, or with breaks, so that people can actually move. And we have to be very clear about that they can stop at any point, and they can, if they decide it's too much, they can leave basically. And what I tend to do as well is to include a practice session, a shorter practice session at the beginning, so that they get an idea of what it is and how still they need to be, and things like that. So that's the first kind of ethical consideration that I think we need to consider. Another issue related to the equipment is the issue, and this is important for participants' consent, is the calibration. I won't get into that, but getting a good calibration of the equipment is key to get good quality data. So the first thing that we do in this type of experiments to set up the equipment is to do a calibration, usually a 9-point calibration, where you would see something like what you see in the screen, and you have to follow those dots. Is basically so that the equipment records the position of your eyes and can provide good data. Now, sometimes it doesn't work, and sometimes you try again and again, and it has to do with the size of the pupil of the participant or the contrast. It really, sometimes there are no explanations, but very often it happens. Well, not very often, but sometimes. And sometimes you cannot proceed with the experiment if you don't get good calibration and good validation. And an important question, I think, for us as researchers is what do we do if calibration doesn't work? First of all, there are implications. Very often in these experiments, participants receive a compensation for their participation. What do you do then? Do you still give them that compensation, or you don't? But then you have to be very clear about that in ethics applications and information sheet for participants. They need to know if for some reason it doesn't work, are they going to receive compensation or only part of it? I think we have to be super clear about the likelihood that this might not work. Something that I also have dealt with is managing a student's disappointment. Sometimes they come and they really want to participate in this study, and suddenly you tell them, oh no, it doesn't work, you can't do it. So something that I've done in the past is to have plan B and have another, maybe a paper version of some of the tasks, so that they actually do something and they don't feel like they haven't done anything. Or just run the study if you can, even if the data is not going to be good at all. So these are important decisions that you have to make beforehand, and have a very clear protocol of what is it that you're going to do in cases where it doesn't work. Another important consideration has to do with particularly this topic, not with all eye tracking studies, but with this topic that I've talked about today, is the task instruction. So if we are exploring incidental learning conditions, participants cannot be aware of the specific aim, because if they know that this study is about vocabulary learning, that the data is like, you can just throw it away, because basically it's not an incidental learning condition. So this is a super important ethical consideration when we are designing studies like these. Usually what I've done in the past is, of course, explaining the ethics application form, why it's not possible to do this, to really reveal the specific aim at the beginning because of the nature of the research. Usually we would tell participants that we would give them a more sort of general aim, like this is about language learning, or this is about reading comprehension. And that's what we would tell them in the information sheet. But then, of course, as soon as they finish, there is full disclosure of what the specific aim of the study was. I mean, sometimes they've already realized because they've done a few vocabulary tests, and then at the end, I think, they might say, oh, I thought the study, really had a focus on vocabulary. Some of them might say that, but it's important that we explain that to them at the end. But it's super crucial in order to do research in this area to actually not disclose the specific aim at the beginning, because otherwise, you're just basically researching a different topic. So that's another very important distinction. And the last consideration, and the last point, I'm sure you were thinking about that when I mentioned this earlier. Very often in this research, and this is not just for eye tracking, but it's for any vocabulary-related vocabulary learning research, it's a very common methodological decision is the use of pseudo words. So words that actually do not exist in the language. They are invented words that look like real words. And this is very common in L1 and L2 vocabulary research, mainly because it has the advantage that it's a good way of controlling for previous knowledge. If you use real words, then you really need to make sure that you control for any sort of previous knowledge that participants had before the study. So that's a very common decision, but of course there is an important ethical consideration here. And I think it's particularly the case when we are doing classroom-based studies. So you're asking them to spend 1 hour of their time doing something to learn words that don't actually exist in the language. So I think that's a very important ethical consideration. And yeah, different researchers have different opinions about these. My take on these, or what I've decided to do is really, I don't do that when we are really doing studies in classroom context. So when we are actually using their language learning time, so we try, we would use real words and account for previous knowledge in other ways. So I tend to use pseudo words only when these are really lab-based studies. They're optional. They come, at their own, outside their normal language learning time. It's an extra activity, and I really try to emphasize what are the benefits. So you won't be able to use those words that you've just learned, but you've been exposed to this and this other thing, and in the text you're also learning about other things. So I think it's important that we also think about what are the benefits. There needs to be still a benefit from the experiment, and I think on the study, I think that's really, really important. So these are some, of course, not all, but some of the ethical considerations of this type of research. And I think there should be time for questions and time for comments now.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. I'm giving you a round of applause all by myself, but that's okay. Thank you very much, Anna. It's great. It was really exciting. And like I said, I'm quite pleased to be the host of this, because it basically means that I get to ask the first kind of questions. And there were a number of things that you've mentioned where I thought, oh, this is interesting, we need to talk about, and this is interesting, we need to talk about. So I'll see whether I can, how many of my questions I can actually get through. Just a quick reminder, anyone who's here, please feel free to pitch in with any questions or comments you may have. Just make yourself known by either switching the video on, unmuting yourself, raising your virtual hand, or by putting a note to me in the chat box. So one of the things that I'm going to ask straight away, first of all, you did say about, the sort of the random nonsensical words that people learn. Would it be possible nowadays to say that actually we can still do that in the classroom, in your personal view, not in the generic view, but in your personal view? Given that in the UK, there is now this push in the early years where the children have to learn to read nonsensical words. So, it's the nonsensical words. I totally agree with you. It's quite a demand to say to a child, well, you're now learning 10 words and actually they don't mean anything. But because that's part of the everyday experience now, does that make it more acceptable in a way?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, these nonsensical words are also very much used in tests where and activities to train pronunciation and phonics and things like that. So it's actually something that they will be seeing. Also, by doing that, yes, you won't be able to use those words ever, but actually you are improving your ability to connect phoneme and graphemes, and that, in theory, that is supporting reading development and language learning development. So yes, I totally agree. I think that's one way of saying, well, this is not vocabulary that you're going to use, but it could really be something that supports your learning in general.
Yes, no, absolutely. I just found it interesting, in terms of obviously the ethics, and I'm going to ask you, you know, how easy or how difficult is it to actually get this kind of work approved, irrespective now of whether you're using the nonsensical words in a classroom environment. But if you're not actually telling your participants beforehand what exactly it is that you're looking for, I can imagine that ethics approval boards may not be terribly excited about it.
Yes, it is. That's why I said it's one of the first things you have to be really, really clear about. What is it that you're telling them and why? Citing research saying, well, you absolutely can't do that because then basically you're not doing research in this area, and you really need to be very, very specific about what is it that you're going to tell them. How they might feel about it when they find out in the end. So yeah, this is a section in the ethics application form that I tend to explain very clearly and try to provide enough details. It hasn't been a problem in the past. As long as you explain very clearly why and what goes in the information sheet and what you're going to tell them in the end and all that. It hasn't been too problematic, but certainly something to address in a lot of detail.
I think, obviously, in my role at our institute, in terms of, looking after the ethics for staff members, I can definitely say that we are generally taking the view that it's not our job to stop research at all. Yeah. Our job is not to stop any kind of research from happening. Our job is just to make sure that the ethics have been thought through and that, that there is a consideration, like you say, of the child and of people's health and of people not coming to any harm, whether that harm is physical or, through being upset or whatever. But generally, I would say that after rigorous review, I don't think any research has ever been completely stopped as such. I think it's more a case of, really, this is something that you're going to have to rethink. Is there a way that you can do that? So I can see when you're saying that, once you've explained it and justified it, that would definitely be the case at our workplace where, the environment is definitely, this is important. We need to find out about it, so therefore we'll support it. But you have to give us the detailed information first.
That has, as I said, provided that I've given all the information, I've never had any issues with approval, but it is an important concern and that needs to be explained.
So some of the other questions that I've got is, again, in terms of ethics, I've got one more question about ethics, and then I'm going to ask you a different one about the actual language learning. But about the ethics, when you're talking about, creating materials that are suitable and appropriate for the eye tracking, because obviously the text has to be a particular size, the lines have to be, particular width and depth and all of that. How difficult is it to create these materials without having a participant there? Or do you, sort of create them together with a trial person, if you like? And how do you get that through ethical approval? That's useful. That's a good point. I mean, usually, of course, we design these materials. It depends on the aim of the study, but of course, trying to mimic the kind of activities that they would do, or the kind of, in this case, the kind of texts that they would be exposed to. Very, very often, we start from an existing, textbook material, and then we modify it to make sure that it fits the requirements of the experiment. Always piloting it with either students, also with teachers. So the piloting of the materials is key. And in my experience, it's never been an issue with ethical applications. With ethics applications. It's always been, the materials have always been very similar, if not the same, but similar to the kind of materials learners would normally use in a normal context. So it's never been an issue
in my experience. I've never, actually presented them with very tricky materials or anything, but so it's never been an issue, actually.
That's interesting because well, in my own research, I mean, I guess it's different because I'm not using text, I'm using images and things, and sometimes when you use images, there's all sorts of reasons as to why you're not supposed to be using images, and what do you do, and
I
so
see.
it's probably in that respect, it's probably a different kind of, it's more to do with it not being a text, probably.
I mean, we do have to be clear about whether there are any sensitive topics that have been, that are mentioned. Yes. Of course, for sure, and say that, none of the topics are sensitive, culturally appropriate. That's another thing.
Yes.
with tests as well. Very often we have to make modifications depending on the country. We run a particular study because we need to ensure that everything is culturally appropriate. So that's certainly something that goes in the ethics application form.
I'm just laughing about that because literally yesterday I recommended somebody some reading from the 1950s, and it's actually really inappropriate language-wise. A piece of work that's been written in the 50s, it's kind of nowadays in modern day language, it just reads
it would
really
never
awfully.
It would never get through now.
Yeah. So the other question I've got is, I mean, this is more to do with the actual research that you were talking about. You were obviously exploring the vocabulary learning in second language learners. Now I'm wondering, I mean, you said early on that there are about 10 to 15% of the saccades that are regressions.
Yeah.
And I totally get, how that works and all of that. But I'm kind of wondering, are the regressions, how can you know that the regressions happen because that child is second language learner and not perhaps, for example, a dyslexic? Because a dyslexic child will also have more regressions. So if somebody is perhaps not necessarily diagnosed with that dyslexia, they may have extra amount of regressions. How do you know?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not trying to throw open your case here.
No.
But I'm genuinely interested in, how do you know that is a language learning issue and not a dyslexia issue?
Yeah, that's a very good point, and there's some research on that. Usually what we try to do is in background questionnaires, trying to get information about any sort of conditions that might affect your reading. Now, sometimes, as you say, participants wouldn't know themselves. So there is no way we could know if a regression is actually, because of, a result, or even, dyslexic readers might have longer reading times, or might fixate more on certain parts of the text. There is no way of knowing just by looking at the eye movement data, really. The way to, yes, ideally, you would want to explore these populations separately, and this is this is why there are studies on dyslexic readers. But usually, in this type of studies, where we have quantitative studies, where we have a large enough group, and we're talking about group patterns. If we have one or two participants who didn't know they actually were dyslexic, and they would still, I don't think that would affect the general patterns that much. Of course, if you have half of the participants being undiagnosed, dyslexic, that would affect the patterns. But we hope that's not really the case. If it's just one or two, just a few participants who don't know about it, then I don't think that would affect results that much. And this is why it's so important to have an enough sample size, so that there is enough power in the analysis and the results. I also tend to ask them at the end of the experiment how they felt about reading it, whether they found any sort of difficulties, because you never know, for not only for dyslexia, but for other reasons. I mean, sometimes people say, "Oh, I really struggled to read this text," or "I didn't really understand." that might, for me, that might be a reason for deleting, data from that particular participant. So, some sort of after reading, exit questionnaire or questions are important, I think, as well as a way of screening that.
That's really interesting. I mean, I'm just particularly interested in that because I have got a son who is dyslexic and bilingual. So we've got, and obviously in school he used to have French lessons as well. So we have gone through all of those difficulties of a multilingual brain that at the same time doesn't read very well. So it's something that's genuinely of interest. And yeah, we've had a lot of sort of issues and tears around that when it was about learning to read. Is quite stressful for parents and children.
And it's it's not always understood properly, really.
And the thing is also, what was interesting with him was that at the time, there were certain things that came through where it was very clear that, his understanding of language and of cultural connotations was impeding some of his basic reading skills. And that's really interesting. So sometimes there was the bilingualism that actually affected the everyday learning. He struggled to read the time in English because he read it in German perfectly. And that's the kind of thing that we were really, really struggling with at a time. It just went, I don't know, there was no logic behind it. This is the problem. And nobody could give you any guidance because that was something that was new to everybody who was sitting there as a stakeholder in that relationship.
And it's so individual as well. I mean, multilingual kids would not necessarily all do the same. So it's really, really tricky. And we all know that in the end, it obviously pays off and the advantages overcome any sort of initial disadvantages and they catch up and all that. But of course, going through that process where you see your kids struggling, it's difficult. And this is why a lot of people move to, a monolingual environment, and they say, okay, let's forget about, trying to maintain these different languages or which of course we shouldn't do. We should all aim for that, but it's more challenging.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much, Anna. This was absolutely exciting. I have got one question here from the floor. So please, do you want to come in or do you want to raise the question in the chat box?
Hi, Anna. Do you hear me?
Hi. Yes,
we can hear you. Yes.
First of all, I'd like to say hi to Anna because I was a previous MA TESOL in-service student.
Excellent.
I registered your SOA course.
It's very fantastic.
Nice. This webinar. And I do have this question since you mentioned about a study about pre-teach vocabulary. Now I'm a secondary English teacher in China and, with very limited experience, but I feel like, regarding pre-teach vocabulary, I feel like it is more beneficial to students who have relatively higher level of proficiency. For higher level proficiency of students, it's better for them to learn students in context. So normally we won't choose to pre-teach vocabulary, whereas lower level proficiency students, we tend to pre-teach them. So hopefully can lower their cognitive demands.
Yeah, absolutely.
I haven't read any papers about empirical studies about that to improve the decision making. So do you have any comments about this? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Of course, this all depends on the participants and their level of proficiency. So there are, so you're right, this pre-teaching of vocabulary, pre-reading instruction of vocabulary is often used the majority of times to support learners who might have difficulties, right, reading that text with those particular words. So we predict those difficulties and say, okay, let's prepare these people better. Let's teach these potentially challenging vocabulary, and then we let them read the text. So that's one, and that's the kind of situation you were referring to, but it really depends on the context. So if we think of the academic context, for example, even very, high level users and learners of a language can often be exposed. This is something that we do, and we see a lot in specialized vocabulary. For example, if you're learning, you're starting university, might be a very advanced user of the language, but you might be completely new to this type of vocabulary. So actually, it's not uncommon in academic contexts to actually see, typical glossary of terms, at the beginning of the unit before actually reading about the topic. So in this context, actually, we might see examples of instruction of vocabulary or intentional learning of vocabulary before reading, even with more advanced learners. So I think it really depends on the topic, and we might use it for different purposes depending on the participants. Does that make sense?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Anna. That was really, really a very, very helpful sort of explanation. I am just very quickly sharing some of the information on the Practice as Research Network, in case anybody would like to subscribe to the newsletter or, find out a little bit more. Also, I would like to highlight that the next seminar is going to take place on the 2nd of November, where Dr. Elena Dragou is going to be talking about ethics research practice. 2 is a company, 3 is a crowd. So she's going to be exploring, that kind of that cusp that we have when we're doing all of those things together, ethics research and practice. So can I just say, Anna, thank you very, very much for today. It was super exciting. It was absolutely interesting. I cannot, I'm genuinely pleased that you've been here and that we've had an opportunity to talk about your work.
Yes.
I look forward to hearing more in the future again.